Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this continuation of our Scientia lecture series for this year. I'm Susan McIntosh of the Anthropology Department. I'm standing in for Jim Pomerantz, who is traveling. I'm a member of Scientia, and I'm very pleased to be here. It's an honor to have the introduction duties today in this third lecture in our series on animals and humans, following Alistair Norcross and Lisa Meffert, both of which have been wonderful lectures. In this series on animals and humans, which is certainly a fascinating topic given the various ways we interact with animals and the fact that we conceptualize animals in ways that help define our own place in the world. Today's speaker is John Zammito. And it's a pleasure to have him here. This is not the first time he's spoken for Scientia. And he received his PhD from Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, and specializes in 17th to 19th century European intellectual history, European history 1500 to the present, the German Enlightenment, idealism and romanticism, and history and philosophy of science, among other themes. He has published several books recently. In 2004, he published a nice derangement of epistemes, post-positivism in science studies from Quine to Latour, University of Chicago Press. Also, University of Chicago Press, 2002, Kant, Herder, and the Birth of Anthropology. As an anthropologist, one of my personal favorites. And The Genesis of Kant's Critique of Judgment in 1992, also University of Chicago Press. He's currently engaged in research on a number of topics. One of them that is relevant to today, which has led to today's topic, is he's tentatively entitled Natura Naturans for the 21st Century, which raises the question whether there is an emergent philosophy of nature that ties together recent developments in the life sciences and in the history and philosophy of science. His aim in this work is to relate his research into the philosophy of the 18th century, inspired by Spinoza's phrase, natura naturans, to current interdisciplinary convergences in life science and philosophy. Without further hesitation, please join me in welcoming John Zammito, Jack Zammito, who will be speaking on the topic, If Animals Are Machines, So Are We, Calling Descartes' Bluff in the 18th Century. Jack.
It's a pleasure, as always, to be addressing the Scientia audience and to continue my very long and very, very strong commitment to Scientia as a faculty workshop at Rice University. Life is but a motion of limbs. All automata, engines that move themselves by springs and wheels as doth a watch, have an artificial life. For what is a heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body? Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, 1651, opening paragraph. What I want to talk about today is the question of whether animals are machines, and if they are, what that means for us. Western man has always dreaded his kinship with animals because his dignity was therewith imperiled. Millennia of efforts sought to affirm not simply the superiority of man, but his utter distinctness from the rest of mere creation, his share in spiritual transcendence in God's image and likeness. The scientific revolution, I suggest, did not want to tamper with that sense of election. It had both a practical and a theoretical way of reformulating it, however. The practical way was to assert, as Bacon and Descartes did so forcefully, that the purpose of knowledge is power, and that science aimed precisely to impose us as, in Descartes' famous phrase, the lords and masters of nature. But to achieve this pragmatic objective, the theoretical approach had to render all the rest of the physical world utterly lacking in value or purpose. In a word, inert. Or, put more graphically, as Carolyn Merchant did, dead, in order for man to exploit it without reserve. A universal physics had no place for a distinct life science. Animate and inanimate matter needed to be submitted to one universal method, mathesis universalis, and its principle, decisively, had to derive from physical mechanics. If all the world but man was to be, in this sense, dead, not only did that mean that all other living things needed to be understood according to the principles of inanimate matter, but that man's life had to be distinctly different. Descartes was claiming that physics would include all of nature except the mind of man. The issue became one of deciding which faculties belonged to man alone. Life, as the philosopher Immanuel Kant came to assert at the end of the 18th century, properly had nothing to do with organism and everything to do with spirit, mind, reason, and will. Descartes called it the rational soul, immaterial, independent of the body, and consequently immortal. I want to chronicle a historical rebellion against what I take to be this multifarious hubris within its own core, to account for the breakdown of Descartes' universalistic mechanism at the point of its most hyperbolic assertion, i.e., the claim that animals were simply machines. The animal-machine debate was not primarily about what animals could do, but about the implications for man. It concerned the adequacy of mechanistic explanation to account for biological and psychological phenomena. And over the course of the 18th century, developments within science itself made Descartes' claim incredible, setting the stage not only for the assertion of independence of the life sciences that would, by the close of that century, eventuate in its finding a proper name for itself, biology, but even more, I suggest, for the assertion that the Cartesian model needed to be set on its head. Instead of imagining animals inert, it was necessary for science to imagine nature, even inanimate nature, as at least potentially alive. This paradigm shift in the second half of the 18th century, which my colleague Peter Hans Ryle has aptly termed vitalizing nature in the Enlightenment, was not simply about scientific practice, however. As with the scientific revolution which preceded it, metaphysics and religion, that is, concerns for the meaningfulness of man's existence in the world, were at the core of it all. And that is why the pivot of the rebellion came when the grand exemption of man which Descartes had postulated within his scheme of the animal machine was undermined, and thinkers were faced with the unbearable prospect of thinking man too merely a machine. Consider the epigraph that I read to you from Thomas Hobbes at the outset. Is life simply motion? That's not the same question as to ask whether there aren't mechanical processes that one can identify in living things. But does that suffice to account for them? Why would one want to undertake such a radical assertion? What was at stake? I want to suggest to you that in the scientific revolution of the 17th century, there were two primary motives or contexts, one metaphysical and one physical. The metaphysical context had to do with two linked impulses, which I take to be central to that century. First, the undertaking to purge natural science of occultism, and we'll talk about what that might mean in a moment. But second, and equally important, to purge religion of magic. Simultaneously, such a project would reconcile science with religion, a concern very dear to the heart of scientists after Galileo's unfortunate experience. And the solution that was developed primarily by René Descartes was dualism. That is to say, the assertion of an utter distinction of transcendence from immanence based on a substance ontology that divided them utterly. The physical context and motive gets us back to whether we can really talk about a scientific revolution, and my colleagues in the field are now having trepidations about such a convention. I don't share those trepidations, I must say. What I would like to suggest is that at the very least, what one can identify with this perhaps scientific revolution of the 17th century is a decided mechanization of the world picture, to use the famous phrase from Dijkhuis. Three principles characterize this mechanization. First, an exclusive focus on matter and motion. Second, the rejection of final causes, both general and particular, in scientific explanation. And finally, a rigid separation, at least in principle, though I suggest violated thoroughly in practice, between natural philosophy and religion. Descartes' view of animal nature was founded upon these commitments, both metaphysical and physical, that I've identified at the core of the scientific revolution. That is to say, his insistence upon a radical dichotomy of res cogitans, thinking substance, and res extensa, physical substance. This dualism made an absurdity of any effort in the classic Aristotelian vein to think of anything that might be construed as an animal soul, a sensitive soul, some sort of intermediary substance between mere inanimate matter on the one hand and human rational consciousness on the other. Here is Descartes on the theme of the bête machine. Quote, "I suppose the body to be nothing but a statue or machine made of earth. We see clocks, artificial fountains, mills, and other such machines, which, although only man-made, have the power to move of their own accord in many different ways. Indeed, one may compare the nerves of the machine I am describing with the pipes of these fountains, its muscles and tendons with the various devices and springs which serve to set them in motion, its animal spirits with the water which drives them, the heart with the source of the water, and the cavities of the brain with the storage tanks. Functions follow from the mere arrangement of the machine's organs every bit as naturally as the movements of a clock or other automaton follow from the arrangement of its counterweights and wheels. In order to explain these functions, then, it is not necessary to conceive this machine as having any vegetative or sensitive soul or other principle of movement and life, apart from its blood and its spirits, which are agitated by the heat of the fire burning continuously in its heart, a fire which has the same nature as all the fires that occur in inanimate bodies. Animals are just machines." And Descartes suggests there are two crucial ways that we can distinguish these machines from humans, namely language and reason. And he concludes, and I think this is vital, quoting again, "The rational soul cannot be derived in any way from the potentiality of matter, but must be specially created. When we know how much the beasts differ from us, we understand much better the arguments which prove that our soul is of a nature entirely independent of the body, and consequently that it is not bound to die with it," unquote. I take Descartes' metaphysical commitments and the theological concomitants of those commitments to be quite authentic and serious. And what I want to suggest is that only by taking them seriously can we understand what the 18th century considered so utterly unacceptable about the Cartesian position, a position that I've called in the title of my paper, Descartes' bluff. And what I want to suggest is that the 18th century proposes to call that bluff. One of the things that's really striking is the way in which the animal-machine hypothesis got immediately appropriated for its religious and theological implications. The key figure here is the philosopher Nicolas Malebranche. The most unmistakable evolution is this tendency to make animal-machine arguments religious in their tenor and significance. Before Malebranche, the writers on the subject of animal-machine were primarily medical physicians. After Malebranche, they were mainly theologians. And what I want to suggest is that this collusion between science and religious metaphysics goes across the board. I think it is absolutely incomprehensible to understand Newton's physics without understanding Newton's enormous metaphysical and religious commitments. The same is true for Leibniz. An enormous outpouring of what came to be called physico-theology thronged the balance of the late 17th and most of the first half of the 18th century, whose objective was precisely to demonstrate the thoroughgoing compatibility of the new science with the old faith. The fundamental concern here was to keep spirit safe by making physics mechanistic in its utter essence. But what I want to suggest is that that argument already had its dangers. Those dangers were pointed out, of course, by Pierre Bayle, already in his Philosophical Critical Dictionary, in an article with the obscure title Rorarius, an obscure writer that Bayle piggybacked on to make his arguments about the dangers of the animal-machine hypothesis. And clearly, from Descartes' time all the way to the time of Lemmatree, who is, of course, the star of my story, the issue of the soul of animals became one of the most perturbed metaphysical and physical questions of the time. One of the best evidences of this is a massive 2-volume piece by someone named David Boulier, who would otherwise be utterly unknown, whose book is called Essai philosophique sur l'âme des bêtes, which appeared in 1728. It was the basis for the article on the animal soul, which appeared in 1751 in the Encyclopédie. What I want to pick up on is a rebellion which begins to gather against this lovely collusion between natural science and traditional religion. A rebellion which called itself materialist and would eventually come to call itself Spinozist, as I will say. Clearly, this mechanistic and or more precisely, materialistic rebellion against the collusion in the sciences and in theology had connections with classical antiquity, with the arguments of people like Epicurus and Lucretius. But what I want to argue is that far, far more central are the developments within science itself. This isn't primarily a philosophical rebellion against this philosophical argument. I want to argue that it is a scientific rebellion grounded in the necessities and essential discoveries of the most important work in life science that went on in the first half of the 18th century and that culminated in what I'm calling a paradigm shift by mid-century. Clearly, there was an anti-religious animus to this movement. I don't want to deny it. I think it's absolutely central to the motivation of these people, and I want to contend as an intellectual historian that there is always a danger of thinking that science happens in some Empyrean realm completely cut aside or cut away from the needs and concerns of people morally, culturally, or politically. That's never been true. It's not true today. It was never true. And it's not true for the people I'm talking about. They were obviously deeply concerned about the metaphysical and religious implications of the science they were doing, and yet what I want to argue is that the science they were doing reinforced them in taking a drastically different metaphysical position. And ironically enough, there was an epistemological loophole for materialism provided by, of all people, John Locke, who is hardly a member of the materialist anti-religious brotherhood. But what John Locke argued in Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding was that we were so ignorant of real essences that we were not entitled to the metaphysical claim that matter could not have the property of thought. And that precisely created the possibility, which was all the materialists needed, to conceive of the possibility of living or thinking matter. And that becomes the basis for the new kind of thought. But what I want to argue, and I think can be clearly evidenced in the literature, is that the very developments in 18th century physiology point towards the more modest epistemological dimension of Locke's intervention. Namely, we cannot know in an absolute sense about ultimate essences. All we can do is make judgments based upon our experiments and observations. In short, what I want to argue that Locke does decisively for this movement is make it scrupulously empirical in its approach to the problems and to the results of its scientific inquiries. And precisely in that measure, to make it somewhat reticent to simply accommodate traditional metaphysical and religious presumptions. There was a noticeable change in the way chemistry and physiology were practiced after about 1740. Instead of trying to follow those elaborate analogies to pulleys and levers, instead, the physiologists began to concentrate precisely on those things that make animals and organisms different. Physiology turned from the description of the body's organs as levers, pulleys, pumps, and sieves to an investigation of those characteristics such as growth, nutrition, regeneration, and generation that make living things utterly different from machines. And the core of what I want to suggest is that the life sciences declared their independence from the kind of mechanistic physics that had become the model from Newton's natural principles of mathematical principles of natural philosophy. But what I want to suggest is that this was accommodated by a change in the physical sciences themselves. That what happens is that in what come to be called in the 18th century the experimental sciences, the sciences of electricity and magnetism, the sciences that investigate forms like light and heat, and in particular, those that are concerned with the generic problem of what force is and where force can possibly come from if matter is inert and matter is supposedly all there is in the physical world. These problems constitute enormous physical scientific issues which a simple mechanistic model of the impact nature of force simply couldn't accommodate, and which had already been problematized by Newton's very idea of gravitational attraction. In addition, I think one of the most decisive things that happens after 1740 is a decisive turn towards the historicization of nature. The recognition that nature itself, the physical world, is not a timeless constant, but has in fact shown dramatic developments. This was, of course, most vivid in the theory of the Earth, the emergence of what would come to be called geology, with the recognition of its changes. Certainly fossils made that all the more salient for living things, but the argument extended even to the construction of the planetary system in the nebular hypothesis that's first developed by Kant and then developed by other thinkers over the course of the 18th century, trying in fact to account for the development of what seemed to be physical regularities in the astronomical universe. And all of these things driven by an epistemological conception that a proper science has to recognize the results of and take into consideration the actual observations and experiences of scientific experiment. And here I want to point to one set of experiments as absolutely and devastatingly crucial. They were published in 1744 by a researcher named Tremblay. And they had to do with the regeneration of polyp parts. What Tremblay did was examine freshwater hydra, which he called polyps. And what he did was chop them into pieces. And utterly incongruously with all existing metaphysical and physical theories, every bit of the polyp regenerated into a complete new polyp. Wham! That completely threw aside virtually every theoretical model operative in the physical and especially in the life sciences, and demanded that new and radical thinking be undertaken. Which brings me to the most notorious book of the 18th century, and to the core of my lecture, Julien Offray Lemmatree's L'Homme Machine, Man a Machine, which appeared in 1747. I know, Sorry. In order to situate Lemmatree's book, I would like to take us to a more specific context of its emergence, namely the enormously important medical school at the University of Leiden and its greatest teacher, Herman Boerhaave. First of all, I want to point out that there was great disappointment in scientific circles about the backwardness of medicine in the scientific revolution. Somehow the life sciences weren't keeping pace with the avant-garde of physics and astronomy and the mathematization of the world sphere. Even the greatest 17th century physiologist, William Harvey, was still lamentably Aristotelian in his ways of thinking. And so there was an engaged effort by the later 17th century to get in step, to become mechanistic in the approach to physiology and to the problems of organism. This got a really fancy name. It was called iatromechanism. That is to say, the approach of mechanism to medicine. And this was all the rage by the end of the 17th century. Perhaps the most famous iatromechanist of the late 17th century was an Italian named Alfonso Borelli, who in 1676 published a text, of course, since he was Italian, in Latin so other people could read it, De Motu Animalium. But the key place where iatromechanical theory was fought out was in the medical school at the University of Leiden, simply the most important school for life science in Europe in the 18th century. Every major medical school in Europe in the 18th century is modeled after the university, the medical school at the University of Leiden, and almost every one uses the textbooks written by the man who is considered the greatest teacher, the greatest academic professor of science of the 18th century, Herman Boerhaave. His textbooks in chemistry, his textbooks in medicine become the textbooks for most of the 18th century. He is regarded as the establisher of these still quite provisional disciplines in the course of the 18th century. Everybody who was anybody went to Leiden to study with Boerhaave. The medical school at Edinburgh is patented on the medical school at Leiden. The medical schools in Göttingen, in Sweden, and even the great enemy medical school, the school at Montpellier in France, show the clear impact of Boerhaave's model of what the medical curriculum should look like. Leiden was the center, in short, of the life science world in the 18th century. And Boerhaave was trying very hard to make the iatromechanical model work, but he was smart enough to realize that he had to bow to empirical results. He couldn't and he wouldn't simply subscribe to Descartes on metaphysical and a priori grounds, and therefore he made a number of important concessions to the inadequacies of the mechanical model. Already, he was being challenged by a German professor at the University of Halle, Georg Stahl, who insisted that this iatromechanical model couldn't work and that we should go back to the wonderful animism of Renaissance science. In a book called Theoria Medica Vera from 1708, he argued that organisms could only be understood in terms of the presence of an animating soul, without which organisms would be impossible. That approach, the regression to animism, couldn't work. But something had to be achieved. One of the arguments that I want to make, and I think Peter Hans-Ryle agrees with me, is that we need to distinguish between traditional animism and the kind of vitalism that becomes preponderant in the second half of the 18th century. And the emergence of that distinction is precisely what I think is at stake in the balance of the narrative that I want to lay before you. I call it a tale of two students of Boerhaave. The two students are Albrecht von Haller, the most important physiological experimentalist of the 18th century, and Julien Offred Lemmatree, the bad boy of 18th century science, the scandal of the century. Okay? And I'm going to side with the bad boy. Haller is famous for his investigation of what he called irritability. That is to say, the response of muscle tissue, even extracted from living organisms, even after an organism is dead, the response of muscle tissue to stimulus, electrical or otherwise. and the contention that therefore muscle tissue has about it, simply by virtue of its physical properties, an immanent capacity for motion, which does not need to be explained by nerve impulses from without, and that does not need to be explained in terms of some animating soul guiding the muscle in its response. For von Hallo, this discovery of irritability was an empirical finding, which, however, he refused to identify with life. Life, he said, was a function of the spirit, and he remained totally committed to a metaphysical dualism, and he was one of the most devoutly religious Christian thinkers of his time. And that was precisely what Lemmatree was going to go after hammer and tong. Lemmatree became famous in France first for writing satires of the Parisian medical faculty, which of course already made him a very bad boy. But then he decided that since these people were such inadequate teachers of medicine, he was a practicing physician, he would go study with a man. And he went to Leiden in 1733 to study with Boerhaave. And that was the transformative moment of his life. He had found the most interesting and exciting thinker. Not that, of course, Boerhaave was flawless, but certainly here was somebody who had a much better approach to medicine. And what Lemmatree decided was that the French needed to hear about this, and the French, of course, would never hear about this unless it was written in French. And so he went about translating it. In 1740, he produced a 2-volume translation of Boerhaave's text, but the text is very dry and technical and hard to fathom. And in the meantime, von Hallo, who was Boerhaave's favorite student, had done a critical edition with annotations. And so what Lemmatree did was simply pick up Hallo's annotated edition and translate it into French without acknowledging Hallo, and making it, instead of these very careful notes that Hallo had added to Boerhaave's text, adding a running commentary in colloquial French about what it all meant. Hallo was royally offended, and he denounced Lemmatree as a plagiarist in the Göttingische Zeitung in 1747. A year later, Lemmatree's notorious Natural History of the Soul appeared, which was the text that got him banished from France. He had to take refuge in Holland. Hallo writes a denunciation of that in the Göttingische Zeitung, again accusing Lemmatree of plagiarism. Lemmatree then publishes anonymously La Machine, and he dedicates it to Hallo, pretending to be one of Hallo's young Swiss admirers and agreeing that every outrageous idea that Lemmatree had published was indeed exactly what Hallo had been arguing, which of course almost gave Hallo a heart seizure. And he writes this very firm denunciation of this text, which of course Lemmatree is then credited with, and everyone laughs because Hallo has taken this all so seriously to heart. And even though, in fact, Lemmatree did mercilessly plagiarize him, he in fact ended up being the star of that very, very nasty exchange. Because what Lemmatree did was expose the utter incongruity between Hallo's experimental results and Hallo's religious and metaphysical commitments. And that was precisely what Lemmatree wanted to do. And he helped in doing so to launch the paradigm shift that I'm interested in. The text was really anonymous. When it came out in 1747, it was immediately notorious. Everyone knew about it, and so it was translated very quickly. And in 1749, it was translated into English and published in London as the work of the Marquis d'Argens. It was only a year later that people realized, oh, it was by Lemmatree. Another one of Lemmatree's texts was taken to have been written by the doctor, the medical doctor, Diderot, which, by the way, he wasn't. The point that I want to make is that these texts of the revolution that I'm talking about in the 1740s were too radical to appear under one's own name, and it wasn't clear who wrote them, because in fact what I'm talking about here is a movement, a very tightly interconnected movement of thought in which Lemmatree, Diderot, Buffon, Maupertuis are all working together in a simultaneous kind of breakthrough to a new way of thinking about life science. In fact, what I want to argue is that we need to get past the title, the scandalous title of Lemmatree's text, which too few people ever have done, either in its time or thereafter. They read "la machine" and they know what it must mean. This is one of those great texts that's been judged by its title from its appearance forward. And precisely what you miss is the profound irony of Lemmatree. What Lemmatree is doing is making a much, much more sophisticated argument. He's making the argument that I use in my title. If animals are machines, so are we. But animals aren't machines, and neither are we. But what we are not is these transcendent spirits either. Lemmatree has a wonderful, wonderful acknowledgement of Descartes that I want to read to you. This is from L'Homme Machine. I believe that Descartes would have been an admirable man in all respects if he had been born in an age which he did not need to enlighten, and had consequently understood both the value of experiment and observation and the danger of straying from them. It is true that this famous philosopher made many mistakes, as nobody denies, but he understood animal nature and was the first to demonstrate that animals were mere machines. Whatever he recounts about the distinction between two substances, it is obvious this was only a trick, a cunning device to make the theologians swallow the poison that men are basically only animals and vertically crawling machines. Now, I submit to you that except if you're Albrecht von Haller, you should read those lines, especially when you read them in French, as just bristling with irony. The last thing that Lemmatree wants to assert is that Descartes held those views. What he's doing is radically and ironically misreading him for the purposes of the 18th century rebellion. Lemmatree pointed out just how easily Descartes could be transmuted into a materialist. By arguing that animals are machines, Descartes opened the door to the argument that the same claim could be made about men. What he was doing was arguing that men and beasts are commensurable, and that if one has a soul, the other does, and if one doesn't, neither does the other. And what he's trying to do, and this I think is the crucial thing, is to open the path for two decisive innovations which constitute the paradigm shift that I'm referring to. First, to embrace what's called transformism, the possibility of natural change in organic life. And second, to make possible a physiological psychology, i.e. to do what we would call today neuroscience. Those are the two decisive agendas of 18th century life science because those are the two boundary points that constitute the problem for making a life science distinct. How is life different from the inanimate? And how is human reason different from whatever we ascribe to the rest of the animal kingdom in the regulation of animal behavior? Those breakpoints, the metaphysicians of the tradition wanted to make absolute and categorical. And what the people I'm talking about are trying to do is blur the boundaries. What they're trying to argue is, are there ways to see how life could be something that could emerge out of inanimate matter? Are there ways to see how rational consciousness could emerge out of physiological process? Those are, I submit, the essential projects of contemporary life science. We are the children of that 18th century revolution. That, by the way, is the thesis of the book that Susan recommended that I'm trying to write right now. What Lemmatree wants to argue is we need a new metaphysical possibility. It's too simple to say either God or blind chance. We need to argue that there's some kind of emergent process in the physical world. That nature is more than matter. That nature is not inert. That nature has the capacity to transform itself. And that's the argument that Lemmatree wants to argue. And what I want to suggest is that he tries to base his argument on the very, very best medical and physiological and biological evidence available to him. Indeed, he makes a wonderful case that what is needed is a new kind of philosopher, the médecin philosophe, the physician who also takes up questions of philosophy, and takes them up because only he is equipped with the necessary data to be able to make real discriminations. He writes, I reject here all prejudiced men who are neither anatomists nor versed in the only philosophy that is relevant here, that of the human body. The physician is the only philosopher who deserves well of his country. Physicians have explored and thrown light on the labyrinth of man. They alone have revealed, hidden under the coverings which keep so many marvels from our gaze, the springs of human nature. Once again, these are the only natural philosophers who have the right to speak on the subject. What Lemmatree argues is philosophy must bow to the evidence of natural science. And the natural science of life is generating evidence that is drastically, totally incongruous with, anomalous for, the prevailing models of iatromechanism. What in particular? Well, one of the things that he's looking at, of course, is the whole development of irritability and the polyp experiment of Tremblay, which, again, as I suggested, decisively overthrew things. But what's really fascinating about Lemmatree is he's also taking up, much more speculatively, but also taking up the recent discovery of the orangutan. This ape from Indonesia was still a relatively unknown and strange species in Europe, but there were widespread conjectures that this animal might be the missing link between man and the animal kingdom. And what Lemmatree argued is, again, taking Descartes literally at his word, it's not impossible that orangutans could be taught to speak, and therefore man's prerogative with language would be dissolved. That seemed totally absurd and presumptuous in the 18th century. I suggested in the spring, when we hear the lady with her parrot, and when we think more about the work that's been done about primate languages, primate speech patterns in the last 15 and 20 years, we should think twice about the arrogance of arrogating language strictly to humans. What I'm trying to argue is that, sure, Lemmatree was a polemical, ideological, reckless writer, but what he was articulating were the vanguard ideas of his age, and that he was plugged into and knew about those developments at the level of experiment and also at the level of their life science implications in a very rigorous way because of his investment in the medical sciences. So I want to read you the summary argument from Lemmatree, quoting him now. Given the slightest principle of movement, animate bodies will have everything they need to move, feel, think, repent, and, in a word, behave in the physical sphere and in the moral sphere, which depends on it. The nature of movement is as unknown to us as is the nature of matter. There is no way of discovering how it comes to exist in matter unless we revive the ancient, incomprehensible doctrines of substantial forms. Hence, I am reconciled to my ignorance about how inert, simple matter becomes active and composed of organs, as I am to the fact that I can only look at the sun through a red lens. Simply admit that organized matter is endowed with a motive principle, which alone distinguishes it from unorganized matter, and that in animals, everything is dictated by the diversity of this organization. That is enough to solve the riddle of the substances and of man. We can see that there's only one substance in the universe, and that man is the most perfect form. I believe thought to be so little incompatible with organized matter that it seems to be one of its properties, like electricity, motive power, impenetrability, extension, etc. No, there is nothing vile about matter, except for crude eyes which do not understand its most brilliant productions. And nature is not a worker of limited ability. No book pissed people off more in the 18th century, and that says a lot. This book was a scandal and an offense to the whole literate and especially religious world. And one of the most damning accusations that was launched against it was the charge This is Spinozism. That was the worst thing you could say about anything in the 18th century. It's Spinozism. That was the worst thing you could say about anything in the 17th century. And they just carried it forward. But what I want to suggest is that something very funny happened to Spinozism in the 18th century. Instead of people being ashamed of it, what the materialists did was embrace it. What they said is, yes, we are Spinozists. Take that. And we're Spinozists not because we're ancient and obscure metaphysicians, but because we're grounded in the latest and best physiological and medical evidence. And Spinozism is the only position that makes sense in the light of that. Interestingly enough, one of the first German critics of Lemmatree pointed out that it was written by Diderot and was, of course, therefore a Spinozist text. And in a wonderful exchange of opinion between Diderot and Maupertuis, they exchanged insults about each of them being more Spinozist than the other. But the thing about this 18th century Spinozism, which I think is absolutely crucial, is that it's different from the 17th century ancestral version. It's different precisely because its origins lie in medical and life science. They lie in physiology. They lie in the best experimental data of the age and in the impulse of that age to try to make some theoretical sense of these crucial anomalies that had arisen in the course of experimental research. I want to close with Diderot's defiant gesture embracing Spinozism. In the Encyclopédie, there is a very long, very, very pious essay on Baruch Spinoza, one of the longest essays in the Encyclopédie, denouncing Spinoza in the perfectly orthodox form. Okay? Remember, this needs to get a royal permission for publication. But immediately after it, there's this tiny little entry called Spinoziste that Diderot published. And I want to read it to you in its entirety. One should not confuse the old Spinozists with the modern Spinozists. The general principle of the latter is that matter is sensible, which they demonstrate by the development of the egg, an inert body which, by the sole instrumentality of gradual warming, passes into the state of being sensitive and alive, and by the growth of every animal, which at the outset is nothing but a point, and which, by the nutritive assimilation of plants, in a word, of all substances which provide nutrition, emerges as a large, sensitive, and living body occupying a large space. From this, they conclude that there is nothing but matter, and that it suffices to explain everything. For the rest, they follow the older Spinozism in all its consequences. Thank you very much.
Now it's our, is this on? Yes. It's our normal practice to accept questions. And we have 2 mics, so give us a chance to get to you. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand, and we'll come around so we can all hear you.
You mentioned the idea of emergence. I think it's an extremely important idea in science. And to my knowledge, in physical science, this idea didn't really emerge in 19th century, perhaps. Well, in the modern sense, when physicists realized how many physical phenomena emerge when you have many particles together, interacting together, there are phenomena that emerge that just simply cannot be explained when you have knowledge of single particles. And that, I think, would become really important even in later part of the 20th century, last century. And it seemed to me in life science, they somehow lead much earlier on this idea than physical science.
I think
And-
they had to.
Right, and you rightly point out that one of the challenges for today's life science is try to figure out how, when you have, say, billions of neural cells together, spirit or mind can emerge, which cannot show up in a few cells or in single cell organisms. On the other hand, the idea of, well, I forgot when the cell was discovered, perhaps in the 18th century, the idea of the cells were not really well developed, but even back, but the idea of infinity at least has been along for since ancient philosophy, right? Both in Greek and Oriental philosophy. So I'm wondering, do these 18th century scientists, I understand their empirical knowledge were based on machines with relative simplicity. So, but the philosophers or scientists, do they have some kind of this emergence idea in a more emerged in a form that kind of resembles what we understand today, or something?
I think that there's a problem with the limits of their knowledge and also their experimental resources. I think that clearly what they have is a motivation to try to make the most of the experimental observations that they make and to try to link those to rather enormous questions about method and about the ultimate nature of the physical process of the world. And I think your mention of infinity is a really good idea, because the development of the problem of infinity, both on a macro scale and on a micro scale, become absolutely central to some of the disputations that drive late 17th and early 18th century scientific and philosophical scientific speculation. They intuit emergence. They see it as philosophically the plausible solution of the anomalies that they're faced with, but they don't have the wherewithal, either empirically in terms of their experimental resources, or indeed theoretically, to resolve those problems. And what's very interesting to me is the degree to which we're still wrestling with a far, far more sophisticated empirical research apparatus to get definitive answers to those same issues, which is why I feel this tremendous kinship between my people in the 18th century and the people that are working today.
As Jack, that's tremendous, and it reminds me of why I fell in love with intellectual history when I was an undergraduate. The essential impulse that you're describing, I think, is the effort that continues today to differentiate between human beings and other animals.
That's what becomes the stake. And I don't believe, I think that for too long in the Western world, we've wanted to make that an absolute distinction, and I think it's harmed us deeply, culturally, politically, morally.
And what I want to ask you is, how has this evolved to today as you see it? I mean,
I think we're having real difficulty in the age of biotechnology, in the age of the kind of life science that we're now doing, to believe very much longer in any kind of definitive differentiation of the human from the non-human, both in terms of technology, that is to say the artificial, and the organic. And I think that the fundamental philosophical challenge we're faced with is to reinvent ourselves as humans without having to have those props of absolute superiority to give us meaning and distinction.
Yeah, so I have a question about the thinkers in that time. I mean, a big problem is uncertainty. Like, how do you deal with uncertainty? Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could comment on how that played into the thinkers of that time.
In fact, what I think is really wonderful about these thinkers is that they're using uncertainty positively. They're using uncertainty as a license to consider possibilities that under an absolutist model of knowledge they would be forbidden to even consider. So they're very aware of it. One of the things that's striking about the best scientific minds, especially in this life science paradigm shift that I'm talking about, is that they're all adamantly insistent about the limitations of human knowledge, about the contingency of human knowledge, about the need to resort to probability already, as opposed to absolute claims of knowledge and truth. But what they're doing with that, which is so exciting, is they're saying, therefore, let's take our empirical data and see where it goes, and let's not worry about it.
I'm sort of struck by the notion that you that you make an argument for, that they made an argument for materialism on the basis of the development of an organism. It would seem to me that one of the most powerful arguments for materialism is actually dementia.
And in fact, from the very beginning, one of the things that's driving physiological psychology is the clear contention by doctors, primarily by doctors in the emergence of psychiatry as a field, that there's a clear physiological relationship between mental dysfunction and mishaps in the brain or other parts of the body. And they're using that precisely to say this kind of absolute division between the rational mind and the material world simply can't be true, given that we know as medical doctors that bad stuff happens. And it happens physiologically, and the consequences are in the so-called rational zone. That's very much part of the argument. Very much part of the argument.
Hi, I'm sorry I don't have much of a voice. I would like to slightly challenge, I guess, the definitiveness of your characterization of the man-animal divide. And I just wonder what you do with that hoary tradition of theriophilia, the argument that beasts are perhaps better than man, or at best we're equal, we have a lot to learn from them, the more we're like them, the better off we are, etc., which was obviously an argument that had very irreligious implications along the lines that you were talking about in your talk. And of course it began with the ancients and was taken up by Montaigne and others in the French tradition. It seems to me actually it was especially significant in the French tradition. So I just wonder, I know it was always a kind of perhaps underground kind of movement, not particularly influential in sort of high philosophy, and yet it was a long-standing trend. So how does that whole body of thought fit into your argument?
That's a very good question. And in fact, there's a wonderful book in French on precisely this question. It's about Montaigne and Descartes. And this whole question of theriophilia and what the Cartesian revolution did to that. And the contention is precisely, and what I'm really taking off from, is the way in which Descartes and the mechanistic impulse of the scientific revolution really quashed, for a time, that theriophilia tradition, made it seem absurd and silly. Descartes didn't hate animals. He just thought that was irrelevant philosophically and scientifically, and that really serious people shouldn't get all hung up about those things. What we needed to do is do real science, and morality, as he said, would follow in due course.
Hi. Okay. I have a couple of questions. One, could you speak about Descartes' own engagement, quite active engagement with physiology? And again, his own insistence that he always understood that there was a relationship between the mind and the brain. Again, having to do with, he went to great pains to try and explain how this relationship worked, even though he's commonly thought to be unsuccessful in that sort of explanation. And then secondly, if you could speak a bit about exactly why, this is sort of surprising for Descartes' perspective, but Descartes could just say that, look, I didn't understand how something like, the examples he uses, the creative use of language as well as mathematical computation. He said, I have no idea how a mere machine could do that. And I don't think that in terms of neuroscience, we have much of an explanation about how that stuff is supposed to be possible as it stands now. It's just as mysterious now as it was then. In fact, ironically for Descartes, it wasn't until the 20th century when Turing and von Neumann explained how a real mechanism could actually accomplish something like recursive functions and understanding symbol manipulation, that actually it looked like a mechanistic explanation for mentality might be the most plausible one, as opposed to one that's grounded in neuroscience in a very generic way.
Those are both excellent questions. Certainly, Descartes devoted a great deal of energy to questions of physiology. The question is whether those questions were experimental or theoretical, that is to say, a priori in formulation. He knew enough to know that there was such a thing as a pineal gland. He knew that we didn't know what the hell it did. And so he conjectured that there must be some reason for it being there. And since he had this terrible problem of linking mental substance with physical substance, he figured that the pineal gland must be the point of transference. I know that that's being rather flip about Descartes' physiology, but one of the things that I think is really important to grasp is the way in which the iatromechanical tradition really primarily invokes him for certain theoretical arguments, not for any kind of empirical or systematic or scientific development of physiology. So yes, he was interested. I think that his results are pretty poor, and I think that the results are largely a priori, in the same way that Newton criticized his general theory of physics for being too a priori and not grounded enough in observation. As to the mathematical limitations, I fully take your point. I think that it would be wrong to say that Descartes' contentions about the difference in human language and the difference in human reason, mathematical reason as an instantiation of that we can observe in humans vis-a-vis animals is not gone. It's still a real problem. And that problem is a problem that these 18th century people that I'm talking about recognized. They just wanted to argue that it didn't lead to an absolute categorical gap. And I would suggest to you that that is precisely the research program that's driving both the life sciences and neuroscience today.
Hi. I'm going to start by saying I'm not sure I see how the mind-body connection is necessarily a problem for the substance dualist, that it rules out substance dualism. And so I wonder to what extent these people were able to do something that, like, either demonstrate a state of affairs that's inconsistent with substance dualism, or show how materialism is a sufficient condition for consciousness. To what extent they did something like that that would do more than provide materialism as an alternative to substance dualism.
I think I'd like to talk more and hear more about why you think that the mind-body problem isn't a problem for substance dualism. My reading of the history of philosophy is that it was one hell of a problem, and that virtually every metaphysician after Descartes wrestled with it. But let's set that aside for a moment and address the second question. I think that the people that I'm talking about took very seriously certain empirical evidence that they had from clinical medical practice. For example, dementia, as Bob represented, and other instances which clearly demonstrated a very direct connection between physiological states and mental states. And therefore, they wanted to argue that that was a research path that needed to be pursued. They weren't ready and they weren't able to bring it to closure. I grant that. But what they're arguing is that's a path that makes empirical sense given the evidence base we have.
I just don't see that as incompatible. I mean, I misspoke earlier. There are problems with the mind-body connection, but what I meant was if they did anything that really excluded substance dualism in some rigorous logical sense. I mean, a substance dualist could affirm that as a research pattern as well, I think, to empirical research into the relationship of brain to mind function.
We need to talk about that, I think, maybe after this. Rachel?
Yeah, Jack, I wonder if you could say a little more about something you mentioned but then didn't talk about much in the talk after, which is teleology and the elimination of final causes. I think you're right about that as part of the so-called scientific revolution. But it makes me wonder about two things, one about them and one about your rebellion. One, if that's true, why is there also such a large interest in the argument from design at that period? And really by the same people. And so, which also might complicate the matter-mind divide that you're interested in drawing, which I don't think is false as it stands. So that's on their side. On the other side, it seems to me that if we want to make moral claims about the value of life, we might have to bring in some belief that teleology is true about nature. And it's not clear to me that people now, or the people you're talking about, are willing to do that. So are they, or are they going to somehow manufacture some moral claims that do not involve that kind of claim?
Those are, again, really, really good questions. On the first, I guess the way that I would want to talk about it is that if you really understand the way that the people of the scientific revolution, the people against whom are rebels or rebellion, wanted to imagine, you have to really zero in on the concept of inertia. And you have to really zero in on what they took matter to be. And if you take matter to be as inert as they claimed it really was, and to say that the physical world is matter and nothing else, which they also claim, you're in a real jam. And that's a jam that Newton and other people saw coming very, very quickly and argued that you needed precisely an external cause to trigger the whole system. This was already what Pascal could not forgive Descartes for. Descartes needed God to give the world to Philip, and then he took a permanent vacation. Right? The argument was somehow force has to be infused into the system. Descartes was content to have it all infused at the beginning. Newton needed it to be pumped in every so often so that God wouldn't go away. My argument is that it's inherent in the inert thesis about matter to make space for a transcendent order of causal intervention through force. Okay, so that's the answer to the first one. As to the second part, teleology is for me the most important and essential issue. How the people before thought it was dispensable, how the people that I'm looking at are going to find it extremely difficult to do without, and how, of course, Kant is going to be totally embroiled in those issues when we get to the end of the 18th century. I'm very interested in the degree, and this is what I'm also involved with right now, the degree to which teleology is very, very much at the forefront of discussions today in the philosophy of life science. I was at a conference this summer in Bluff of this, I love the name for the society, the International Society for the History, Biology, and Social Study of Biology. And one of the most important themes of that whole conference was the problem of teleology and the Kantian origins of possible solutions or resolutions to that problem. So you're right on target. That's exactly where my research is focused.
Hi, Jack. I was wondering if this is not so much a question, but a request that you address another area that hadn't come up, and that's the question of Freud and where he places in all of this. And I ask because so often when we teach and read texts by Freud, like Civilization and its Discontents, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, we get Freud the philosopher, and we also get Freud the scientist, and many of us skip the science. And I'm just wondering, since I know that you are someone who knows a great deal about Freud as well, if you could talk a little bit about his place, or does he have one, in the question of man and animal, clearly in all his theory of the subject. He is talking about a psychic realm that he sees as normal rather than necessarily pathological, something that has to do with man as an organism, as an animal organism in an animal world.
Again, a very good question. There's method to the madness of my approach, which is to study the 18th century and the 21st century, and to try not to have to deal with everything in between. But Freud is a very, very interesting case study in the way people are trying to do this kind of thinking 100 years later. He's trained in a very reductive kind of mind science, of physiological psychology, and what he begins to do is realize that it doesn't work, and that you need to deal with problems of consciousness at a different level altogether, at a level that we call the symbolic or the discursive. And that, I think, is a recognition of the aridity of the failure of the research program that dominated psychology and psychiatry in the late 19th century. So I think that there's a lot to be done there. I'm not doing it. Steve.
Yeah, I just have a real simple and I hope quick question about, I don't really see the difference between the old vitalism and the new vitalism.
What I call
yeah, right. I don't see what the key difference is there, and maybe this is something of an irrelevancy perhaps, but how would you situate something like mesmerism in this geography here?
Oh, that's a great question. Actually, I would sort of not want to use mesmerism to answer the first question, but I'll talk about each. The way in which I would like to characterize the new vitalism as against the old animism, is precisely in terms of the characterization of an ontologically distinct, discernibly, philosophically identifiable soul substance, which drives or organizes the organic process. The New Vitalism doesn't believe that. The New Vitalism wants to argue that the phenomena, the functions that are discerned in organisms are emergent properties out of complex orders of physical form. There is no soul substance. There's simply a highly creative, highly advanced form of function that emerges out of physical process as such. It's a monosubstantial theory. But mesmerism, to touch on that just for a second, mesmerism is a very, very interesting effort to play the music backwards. If we know that the body affects the mind, then we also must be aware that the mind can affect the body, not simply in terms of conscious will, but also in terms of the way in which those involuntary or subconscious, to use a terrible word, processes of interaction between mind and body work, and therefore if you play with the mind, you can in fact induce significant physiological changes in the process. That's what mesmerism is.
But I mean, you're really trying to tap into some kind of juice, right, so to speak, something that, so it's sort of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, whether you say that it's some ontologically distinct, whatever you want to call it, life stuff, or whether you're going to say that it's, just a property of matter, that it happens to be able to have force in it, or move, or, I mean, I'm not even talking about sort of the spirit dimension, I'm talking about down at the anti-mechanistic hypothesis that matter itself has some kind of impulse, some kind of spark, some vis, some force in it, that strikes me as close to saying, well, it's got this spark of life in it, kind of. And so we can, of course, eventually get life out of that because it's already in there.
I confess to being guilty of all charges on this. And the way that I would want to formulate it is, one of the things we've done is said that matter, as it was traditionally conceived of physics, is simply a bogus idea. And that we really need to think about nature as energy. Energy, I suggest, has many of those attributes that you're suggesting have that quasi-metaphysical character of this associated. And certainly that's where I'm going, Steve. I'll admit to it. All right.
Are there other questions? One more?
So one of the ways I tend to think about the way in which the occult sciences disappear and things like gravity or vitalism emerge is as a change from this sense that there are hidden causes, hidden forces, and that maybe through some experimental trick we can get them out, put them in bottles and do something with them, to a place where we say, well, no, we're not going to worry about what those causes are anymore. We can be uncertain about them. We know they exist. We know gravity exists. We know vitalism exists. And we'll leave it aside. We won't go any further. So is that, when you mentioned near the beginning of your talk something about how this was going to be a reaction against, well, I'm not exactly sure what you were going to say about where the occult sciences fit into this. But do you follow that kind of narrative?
Yes, very, very much, very much. What I want to suggest is that it's a good place to start, but no one's been able to stay there. And what happens is that precisely what happens when you say, I'm going to be epistemologically agnostic about where gravity comes from. Even Newton wasn't happy. He couldn't solve it, but he wasn't happy. Okay? And no one's happy with that kind of epistemological agnosticism in science. And so the move is ultimately going to be towards a more compulsive, more gripping theoretical articulation of what those things are and how they work. And that's what we've been doing. So yes, that's exactly the way that the epistemological wedge gets driven in so that you can sort of get rid of those occult theories, so-called, and open up to this new world of mechanistic account. And then with Newton, it gets all weird again because here the occult force is coming back in and we just say, well, science doesn't care about where they come from, just how you mathematically account for them. That doesn't last. It can't last. It has never lasted.
I want to thank Jack for giving us a wonderfully dynamic lecture, followed by a memorable and intellectually engaged extended period of questions and answers and discussions. Just thank you so much. This is why we always look forward to and feel privileged by Jack's presence on our lecture roster. Please let us continue the conversation outside. We have a little reception and food, and please also join us for the next Scientia lecture on December 6th, when Dr. Huda Zogby, professor of pediatrics and neuroscience at the Baylor College of Medicine, will talk about mouse studies and what they teach us about neurodegeneration, deafness, and breathing. Thank you all very much for coming.